Great bumptious Belfast, with its slum schools, its rotten municipal system, its ludicrous pride, its bigotry and intolerance. Belfast, with its palatial town hall and its army of little white slaves. In 1907, Dublin may have been the centre of British rule in Ireland, but industrial Belfast was the greatest success story of the Edwardian age. Less than a year old, her new city hall was a proud symbol of a city with the world's biggest shipyard, factories and mills. But Belfast was a powder keg waiting to explode. This is a story buried and forgotten for the past 100 years. The story of one short summer when Catholic and Protestant fought as one in a battle between masters and men. This is the story of the Great Belfast Dock Strike.
In one way, the 1907 Dock Strike is a very Irish story. It's one of sudden events, electric moments, heroism, bravery, and ultimate failure.
January 1907, a cross-channel steamer sailed into the port of Belfast. On board, the future Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald, along with Keir Hardie and other fathers of the British Labour movement. Their view of the Antrim Hills would have been obscured by a thick smog from hundreds of factory chimneys. But no haze could conceal the 5 miles of bustling docks or the giant gantries of the shipyard. They had chosen this mighty industrial city as the venue for the first ever conference of the British Labour Party. In England, there were calls for workers' rights, better pay and conditions. In America, Germany and Russia, the winds of change were also blowing. And within 4 months, Belfast would be crippled by a strike, a demonstration of working class unity which showed that there was an alternative to the sectarianism for which this city was already notorious.
1969, 1970, 71, I was an idealist, hoped that it was possible to change the world overnight and believed in Catholic and Protestant unity. One then asked oneself, were there episodes in history that at least provided some sort of an example as to how it might have happened in the past or how it might be done?
In 1971, historian John Gray began to research industrial disputes in Belfast during the summer of 1907.
I intended to write an article. I thought it would be an afternoon's research. And I went up to the old newspaper library at the top of the Shankill and was simply staggered by what I found in those old yellowing newspapers, day after day after day. An account of a huge crisis in the history of the city, one that's somehow been completely eliminated from our history.
Unearthing this forgotten story would become an obsession and occupy his life for the next 15 years.
Obviously, in doing that, I ruled out doing all sorts of other things. 20 years after finishing it, I would still say that probably it's by far and away the most significant thing I've actually done with my life.
The explosive events of the summer of 1907 sent photographer Alex Hogg onto the streets. The pictures he took are an extraordinary visual record of the crisis in his city. They have never been seen in public.
1907 is a very inconvenient history for those who would characterize our entire experience as just being that of sectarian division and unionism and nationalism.
The story begins on January the 20th. The Royal Irish Constabulary were watching the waterfront, waiting for the arrival of a troublemaker. They were looking for a big man wearing a faded greatcoat and a large-brimmed hat. He was here to attend the Labour conference, but this stranger had other work to do in Belfast. He slipped past them and disappeared into Sailor Town. The port was crucial to Belfast's industrial success. Sam Kelly's coal boats brought the fuel that drove factories and mills, and ships took the produce of those factories to England and the farthest corners of the British Empire. But Belfast's prosperity was built on the back of an unskilled workforce who earned the lowest wages in Britain. And at the very bottom of the social pyramid were the coal heavers and dockers. In 1957, the BBC recorded interviews with working men who recalled the harshness of life on the docks in the early years of the 20th century.
Oh, it was very hard. Oh, God bless you. Though some was going about, and I known them till see them myself in my own eyes. Their backs, raw flesh, you know, and the wet, the sweat and all of that. There's not one of them, you could hardly say, had a boot in their foot. You'd say to yourself, in the name of heaven, how does those men exist at all, how they live?
The nearest way I can describe the employment of casual dockers is a cattle market. The stevedores would come out, look at the throng of men seeking employment. If they fancied one as against another, hand them a token which entitled them to start work on that day.
Like Belfast itself, the docks were divided. The cross-channel docks, where the work was regular, were predominantly Protestant. Catholics, who worked casually on the deep-sea docks, were among the most deprived workers in the city.
60, 65-hour week, very poor pay, often being paid by stevedores in pubs, on condition that you bought the stevedore a whale of drink out of your miserly pay. Great dangers, health and safety risks, carrying heavy sacks down narrow gangplanks or lifting gear snapping and dropping bales of this, that and the other on dockers in holds. It was a bloody business being a docker.
The mysterious stranger who had arrived in January knew very well the hardships the dockers endured. He had been one himself. His name was James Larkin. The grandson of a County Antrim tenant farmer, Larkin knew real poverty growing up in Liverpool. He was a committed socialist, and when an industrial dispute cost him his job, he joined the National Union of Dock Labourers as an organiser.
He led dockers, but he also wished to instill in them a greater discipline in how they carved out a better future for themselves.
His mission in Belfast was to recruit as many men as possible into the Union.
There is no such a thing as Catholic and Protestant with God. The whole lot of them cried away with...
This city has long been susceptible to the power of a passionate orator. At the beginning of the 20th century, Customs House Square was Belfast's Hyde Park, the Custom House Steps her Speaker's Corner. Here, fire and brimstone preachers would thrill the crowds with their rhetoric and the power of their voices. Larkin had a new and dangerous gospel to spread, and he was a mighty preacher.
A voice that prior to the era of the microphone could carry across streets filled with carts passing to and fro, or more to the point, carry across vast crowds.
I think in those days, the ability to address a mass meeting, like Daniel O'Connell, like Roaring Hannah, like these great 19th century figures, was all important in politics because, you know, we didn't have mass media really. A minority of people could read and write. So people attended these great torchlight processions where a speaker would propel his voice great distances.
Larkin, in his person, seemed to epitomize the revolt of humanity in a manner and in a form never before expressed.
I would presume the places that Larkin might well have gone is precisely those assembly points where the stevedores were treating casual dockers like cattle every morning.
He just saw one thing, a social injustice, and he went for everything and everybody that stood between social justice and that person. And that meant that to the average and unthinking man and woman, Larkin was an idol.
One thinks undoubtedly of Tom Paine's Rights of Man in the 1790s, described as the Koran of Belfast, read by everybody. Well, you could argue very similarly that for the totally disenfranchised of the Belfast of 1907, and I'm thinking dockers and the unskilled, the kinds of concepts and ideas that Larkin arrived with were similarly electrifying.
He once told a group of dockers to look to the gulls wheeling over their heads. He said if he wrapped loaves of bread in sashes of orange and green and threw them into the lagan, that the men would drown trying to save the sashes while the gulls made off with the bread. Two brothers, John and Jack Flanagan, listened and followed where Larkin led. Their deep social convictions are proudly recalled by a former chief constable of the RUC, Jack's grandson.
Now, he had been a career soldier. He'd fought in the Boer Wars, and when they finished, I think about 1903, he came off the army and worked in the docks with his brother James. So James and Jack, both very passionately socialist for that period, very closely worked with Larkin and with Connolly, but absolutely determined to ensure that religion, sectarianism, would not divide the people whom they wanted to represent, the people who worked in the docks, as my grandfather and my great-uncle did.
The 1906 general election in England had been a landslide victory for the Liberals. Belfast was still ruled by conservative unionism and big business. But two men from working-class areas were elected to Westminster. Both would play their parts in the drama that was about to unfold. Thomas Sloane, a shipyard worker and evangelical preacher from Sandy Row. And from Hamel Street, a former barman and a champion public speaker, wee Joe Devlin.
In the House of Commons, once heckled by an opponent who said Joe was extolling the virtues of the Irish language and the need for government support, and a unionist shouted, you know, "Can you speak Irish, Joe?" And his immediate reply was, "Yes, better than you can speak English." You know, this was wee Joe Devlin.
Sloane was one of those from the stable of biblical oratory. You know, that's where he got his grinding, whether at the Customs House steps or in the shipyard, Bible in hand.
He was a working man. He saw the difficulties, he saw the deprivation, he saw the hardship which the working man at that time had to endure, and he reacted against that.
Sloane had been expelled from the Orange Order for daring to stand against their chosen candidate. He was now the most popular figure in the breakaway Independent Orange Order, a movement which represented a strong new voice in Protestant working-class life. Larkin would come to depend on its members in the months ahead. Sloane was the public face of the Independent Orange Order, but it was their Grand Master, the campaigning journalist Lindsay Crawford, who would write their radical manifesto. It was based on democracy, social justice, and the possibility of unity between men of different faiths.
They weren't prepared to accept domination by the ruling classes, and they were prepared to step out and say, we're not taking this any longer.
On the dockside, Larkin was instilling this same dissenting spirit in both Catholics and Protestants.
The one thing Larkin had that an Irish audience will always respond to, and that is, you put your heart into the story and give the people your heart.
3 months after arriving in Belfast, Larkin, a Catholic, had recruited almost all the city's dockers to his union, many of them independent Orangemen. Another independent Orangeman who would become a key player was Alex Boyd, union boss of the municipal employees.
Think of Boyd toiling for years to recruit the odd half-dozen union members here and the odd half-dozen union members there. And along comes this electric street orator who, in the space of 3 months, demonstrates how you recruit 2,500 union members.
Fearing a gathering storm, Belfast's big shipping companies contacted the International Shipping Federation in London, an organisation that had recruited armies of scab labour to break dock strikes across Europe.
Globalization was already in play as far as the employers were concerned, and they were making their preemptive arrangements to ensure that when this dispute that they confidently expected would started, they would have a ready supply of blackleg labour.
On the 26th of April, at Sam Kelly's coal quay, the storm broke. Larkin's men were spoiling for a fight. When attempts were made to dismiss union members, the men took matters into their own hands. The entire workforce walked out. And Sam Kelly locked them out. He did not consider that such a lowly class of men had any business joining a trade union. But he had underestimated his workers.
His blacklegs ashore were rushed and hustled off the scene. Any men on the ships who refused to surrender immediately were pounded with rocks and told to get the hell out of there. And they duly did. And Kelly suddenly discovered that instead of having snuffed the thing out, he was on a losing wicket.
Kelly capitulated, granting union recognition and a pay rise. On a victory march through the town, dockers carried a Union Jack and sang, "Britons never shall be slaves." But the Kellys' dispute was a mere skirmish. The real battle was about to begin. On May the 6th, without consulting Larkin, union men aboard a Belfast steamship company vessel refused to work with a non-union foreman. They walked out, not realizing they had awoken a sleeping tiger, the owner of the Belfast Steamship Company, Thomas Gallagher.
The Kellys' dispute was a preliminary scuffle. The Gallaghers' dispute was the trigger to the whole thing.
The millionaire tobacco king had made Gallagher a household name throughout the United Kingdom. One of Belfast's best-known self-made men, he expected unswerving loyalty from his workers. This walkout was a betrayal, and one he would not take lightly.
The metaphor that I think employers like that would freely have adopted for themselves was that of a captain of a ship, very appropriate for a seaport. And of course, one of the points about being a captain of a ship is that when you're at sea, you are in total command, and essentially anybody who says, hang on a minute, let's send the ship another way, well, you know, mutiny is what comes to mind, and you deal with it accordingly.
Larkin knew that his men had made a serious tactical error. He tried to negotiate, admitting that a mistake had been made, urging that they be allowed back to work. But the tobacco king refused.
Thomas Gallagher saw his chance. The men were out. He wasn't going to let them back in until he had smashed the union.
On the 8th of May, he brought a squad of blackleg labourers from Liverpool. Larkin's men rushed the steamship company's sheds and drove the blacklegs back onto the boats. Gallagher called for police protection and the use of force against the strikers. Larkin denounced him as an obscene scoundrel, a man who valued neither country, God, nor creed, the one snake St. Patrick left behind in Ireland. At Gallagher's urging, the Lord Mayor ordered troops to the quays. The battle had begun.
In a sense, the whole momentum of the strike in terms of becoming a generalised crisis is driven every bit as much by Thomas Gallagher as it is by James Larkin.
But by mid-June, the strike had stalled. Protected by police and soldiers, Gallagher was holding fast. Larkin tried to widen the dispute, hoping that English railwaymen would join the strike, but they did not come out. By June the 26th, it was clear. The men in Belfast were on their own.
They've achieved some piecemeal gains, but the core of the dispute is still totally unresolved. There's no immediate prospect of winning. The quays are by now successfully guarded by a combination of police and cavalry, which have been requisitioned by the Lord Mayor. So there's no way of breaking through to the Blacklegs. So what do you do next?
Larkin had reached a tactical impasse. He needed a new strategy, and he turned to the carters who transported goods between the city and the docks.
So on the 3rd of July, he and the other Labour leaders are to say, tomorrow not a wheel of a cart will turn in Belfast.
Almost overnight, Larkin took the strike from the dockside onto the streets of the city, and he brought Belfast to a standstill. Hundreds of men patrolled the streets, Catholics and Protestants together, manning the picket lines which appeared on every corner. The employers turned again to blackleg drivers to move their goods.
And woe betide the blackleg carter who sets out on this mission. It was a relatively simple matter to cope an old four-wheel cart. In short, they succeeded in paralysing the trade of Belfast.
Pickets were at work from an early hour all over the city, and in some places they did pretty much as they pleased. Drivers are becoming afraid to go out.
Employers brought in traction engines, never before seen in Belfast. The people marvelled at these new machines, and then found ways to wreck them.
Working men who had been previously considered beneath the notice of respectable Belfast, actually in control of the streets and the life of respectable Belfast. We're talking shock horror country here.
It was inevitable that someone would set the sectarian hair running. The employers turned to the old tactic of divide and conquer. The most obvious target was the Catholic, Larkin.
They thought that they were responsible for Belfast's status as a major kind of world industrial centre within the great free trade market of the British Empire. And they saw that threatened. And so it was very easy for many of these businessmen who overlapped with unionism, you know, to claim that this was a nationalist plot, even a Fenian plot.
But Larkin, the wily tactician, had long anticipated this move. He was not about to let sectarianism break the strikers' unity.
Larkin actually, at one meeting, resigns the leadership of the strike because of allegations that have been made against him, and to snuff them, you know, at the outset, to say, you know, this strike is not dependent on any one man, and that it had been agreed that Alec Boyd, the head of the municipal employees, would take over the leadership of the strike.
It was a masterly stroke. Within 3 days, Larkin was back at the helm, with both Protestant and Catholic strikers even more firmly behind him. Fired by his example, Alex Boyd now spoke on strike platforms all over the city. The power of Larkin's oratory brought Sandy Road to a standstill. On the Falls, Boyd was cheered until the echoes rang. He told his listeners that this was war to the knife. The Northern Whig declared, "We are on the eve of an experience similar to that which has paralyzed Russian cities." But the July holidays were approaching, and employers confidently expected that the old divisions would break the strikers' unity.
Yes, there were disturbances on the streets in Belfast in July 1907, but they had absolutely nothing to do with sectarianism.
At our 12th demonstration, then there were collections taken up for the striking dockers, because the members were the striking dockers, and these were the men who were wearing the orange collarettes and the orange sashes. These are the men who were walking behind the leadership of the independent movement, and of course they were going to support those men.
There were huge strike meetings all over the city, but on July the 26th, there was an extraordinary example of mass popular mobilization, the Great Trades Council demonstration.
One estimate has it that 100,000 people took part in a march that travelled through Sandy Row, across the Falls Road to the Shankill Road, and then back to the city centre, where the crowd was so great that it had to be addressed from 4 separate platforms. The possibility within that kind of movement was the possibility of the beginnings of the construction of a new kind of future.
But the Carters' strike had caused thousands of layoffs from crippled industries. The strikers faced starvation, and the strike leaders were in dire financial straits. They were now involved in a war of attrition, for which the workers were ill-equipped.
I mean, you have to recognize that throughout this period, the employers not only did not accept arbitration, they refused to meet with Larkin as the organizer of the National Union of Dock Labourers.
Desperately short of funds, Larkin turned to the man who had recruited him into the union, the leader of the NUDL, James Sexton. On July the 19th, Sexton arrived in Belfast, promising that if necessary, his union's reserve fund of £20,000 would be given to the men locked out in Belfast. But when he realized how volatile the situation actually was, Sexton quickly pulled back from his early offers of support.
I think there was increasingly also an element of downright jealousy with regard to Larkin's meteoric success.
Sexton and other union bosses caved in. They offered piecemeal settlements to employers who now decided to listen, but only if Larkin and the other strike leaders were excluded from negotiations. From the beginning, Larkin had preached unity. This was divide and conquer. The employers' tactics were being used by the leader of his own union to put an end to Larkin's costly Irish adventure.
In union terms, what they didn't want to get involved in was some out-of-control, vast action which they felt they might have to fund. In very English terms, what they didn't want to involve themselves in was supporting Irish lawlessness.
The police were getting a very rough time. And at the same time, the police being native and drawn from working class, saw what was happening, and their faith in their own cause began to weaken. And they were getting a terrible lot of abuse, and consequently they felt that they weren't going to sit on lorries and get a hiding with stones and all sorts of abuse, for they had to live at home.
It's the police service who invariably are injected between one faction and another, who absorb violence from one or from the other, or sadly too often from both. And so often they're the people who are expected to hold the line.
But the line was stretched to breaking point. For the previous 3 months, RIC men had been on the streets in force, working long hours to cover the extra duties of escorting blackleg drivers. Acting Commissioner Morell was an arrogant, insensitive man and completely unaware of the growing discontent within the force.
The match that lights the touch paper is then the strike itself.
On July the 10th, a letter from an anonymous constable appeared in the Irish News.
The strikers are, as ourselves, trying to better their conditions. If we work together, we will wring from the government what I trust the strikers will soon wring from the capitalists: more pay.
But the entire working class community of the city was solidly behind the civilian strikers, and the police were put in great difficulties with the communities they actually had to live in.
Yeah, and I can imagine just how difficult that must have been, to be asked to conduct such duties in respect of people for whom you in fact had every sympathy.
And then if you escorted blacklegs for 12 hours a day and were taken off work 5 minutes before you were due to get overtime payments for it, it would hardly have helped.
My goodness, and these are all the things that went on. Well,
These were all the things that went on.
Well, certainly the terms and conditions for police officers today, and even when I joined and right throughout my service, were very different to that, thank goodness.
I think the pay was a lot better.
On July the 19th, a constable, William Barrett, was ordered to sit beside a blackleg driver. He refused and was instantly suspended.
They were people who were prepared to serve the public in difficult circumstances, so it must have been difficult for them to bring themselves to a position where they were not obeying the orders that were being issued to them from on high. So you can imagine just that it illustrates the tremendous difficulty, the turmoil that must have been going on in the city generally.
Barrett himself had 11 years service, commendations for excellent service, etc. He was a solid man, a solid policeman, but clearly something of a leader of men, and it was no insubstantial group that he was leading.
News of Barrett's suspension sent shockwaves through the force. A circular was issued, calling the men to attend a meeting in Musgrave Street Station on July the 27th. Supremely overconfident Morell issued instructions that no such meeting would be held.
Those in charge of the police had told Dublin Castle they didn't expect much to happen. And what happens? You have this massive meeting of dissident policemen.
So, John, this is the actual room where the meeting would have been held first. I mean, many times I've been in here. I think it was probably a bigger room. You know, I think that's a wall that has been added since. But this is where it actually took place.
I think we need to think of a larger room, and also a larger room packed to the doors with very angry policemen.
What was the Constabulary of Ireland, as created in 1822, became the Royal Irish Constabulary, was renowned for its discipline. So I assume Assistant Commissioner Morell expected exactly that: absolute discipline, absolute obedience to any orders that he would give. And of course I learned that in the course of that meeting, that's not at all what happened.
Well, you come through the door today in rather happier circumstances than Acting Commissioner Morell, who in July 1907 came through the door and ended up being knocked over by his own men. Who then, such was the strength of feeling, who then rushed out into the square, threatening to march out into the rest of the city.
Between 500 and 800 policemen lined up 2 deep in the yard. When the gates were opened, Morell shouted, "I appeal to you, for God's sake, don't go any further with this thing. Don't go outside that gate into the street. don't make a disgrace of the policemen of Belfast. Barrett was lifted shoulder high, and the men made for the Custom House steps. Barrett told the huge crowd that the police, like the strikers, were entitled to fair pay and conditions. He read telegrams of support from RIC barracks all over the country. Morel was horrified. This was mutiny. Morel had completely lost control of the situation. He dispatched panic-stricken telegrams to Dublin Castle saying, "The situation looks very bad. I think you ought to expect the worst."
The next occasion in which Dublin Castle was as badly caught out by a public event, a law and order event in Ireland, was at the time of the 1916 rebellion. I mean, that may be exaggerating it, but it was the same degree of a total lack of awareness as to what was actually happening on the ground.
From Dublin Castle, Sir Anthony MacDonald, the ambitious Catholic Undersecretary, took swift and decisive action.
It's one thing to let unionist employers in Belfast stew in their own juice. It's quite another thing to have a dramatic threat to law and order in Ireland as a whole. The rapidity and the extent of their reaction was quite incredible. They rushed 5,000 troops to Belfast, including Maxim machine gun units, searchlight units. 9 battleships from the Atlantic Fleet moored at Bangor. There was going to be no more nonsense after this. We're going to teach what he called the turbulent classes a lesson.
Barrett was dismissed. 300 of his comrades were transferred. So was Morel. As troops set up camp in Ormeau Park, the new RIC commander put an overwhelming show of force on the streets. Overnight, the workers lost control of the city. The strike leaders were paralyzed. In a last desperate effort to force arbitration, they invited the city's MPs to a mass meeting, hoping that they would lend support to the strike in Parliament.
Of course, the Customs House meeting turned out to be something of a damp squib, really, for the Labour movement, because only Devlin of the MPs who were invited turned up.
At the very last moment, on the flimsiest of excuses, Thomas Sloane copped out. That, I think, is to do with Thomas Sloane, the weather vane, feeling, hang on a minute, this is slipping out of the area of safety for me to be involved in. Result, the only MP who speaks is Joe Devlin.
But Devlin was walking a tightrope between right-wing Catholic interests and the workers who voted for him.
Well, broadly speaking, Devlin was sympathetic to ordinary working people and their conditions. That did not mean any commitment to trade union organisation, let alone the dangerous waters of socialism, which, after all, was anathema to the Catholic Church.
Wee Joe used his considerable ability as a public speaker to denounce the presence of troops in Catholic West Belfast, his own constituency.
He's been accused of opportunism, and that's probably correct, in 1907, in that basically he was reminding Irish nationalists that the Home Rule Party opposed the role of the Crown, and he described, for example, the Lord Mayor of Belfast, who was a businessman, as the Tsar of Belfast, recalling the kind of brutal murder of the workers on Bloody Sunday in Russia.
Devlin could not have known how prophetic these words would be, nor what they would cost his own people.
In terms of what then subsequently happened, certainly Joe Devlin, I think, played his part in whipping up feelings in his own constituency of West Belfast and on the Falls Road in particular.
On the 8th of August, 2 drunks fighting on a street corner were arrested. With tensions running high, an angry crowd gathered. Photographer Alex Hogg was there to bear witness to what happened next.
overwhelming force, a terrifying force. I mean, you know, we have this photographic evidence of cavalry charging down the Grosvenor Road. A detachment of infantry sets off down the Falls Road. Is attacked from the side streets and reaches a point where it's facing a fairly overwhelming group of stone throwers ahead of it, but its retreat has not been cut off. The major in charge reads the Riot Act. Nobody can hear a word he's saying, and the infantry open fire.
The troops were on unfamiliar ground. From the warren of back streets around the falls, the rioters pelted them with paving stones. Boiling water was poured down on them. Wires were stretched from house to house to topple the horses. It was a pitched and bloody battle that went on all night and continued the following day.
Why did the troops intervene in the Falls area on that Saturday evening? There was actually no objective reason why they needed to intervene in force on the Saturday evening. All the carting was over for the day. There was nobody to protect. I think it was back to this concept of teaching the turbulent classes a lesson.
There were scores of casualties. A 23-year-old mill worker from Conway Street who had gone out to search for a child was among the dead. Her name was Maggie Lennon. No suggestion was ever made that those who died were anything other than innocent victims. Maggie's picture was printed on postcards. She was hailed as a heroine of the left. Thousands attended her funeral in Milltown Cemetery. The Unionist press were quick to react. The combination of Devlin's speech and the riot on the Falls gave them all the ammunition they needed. Fred Crawford, later to come to prominence as a UVF hero, positively celebrated what had happened.
He noted in his diary how delighted he was that all the rioting had been in the Catholic nationalist Falls Road area, and that up to then there had been all this embarrassment that there had been Protestants and Orangemen involved in the strike movement, and that now it would be possible to label the thing as essentially just another in a long history of nationalist rebellions and uprisings.
Larkin protested in vain that the press were making this a sectarian issue, but the damage was done. The strike had been tarred as a nationalist plot. Protestant support fell away. On August the 17th, when the carters returned to work, the strike was effectively over, and the dockers were on their own. Only a month before, the workers had marched as one through Belfast's sectarian ghettos. Inspired by Larkin, they had demanded a better future. Now, with starvation staring them in the face, they begged to return to their old jobs.
As one of the veterans I spoke to in the 1970s said to me, I felt a pity on those men. Some of them never got back to their work.
To bitter, beaten men, it was as if the strike had never been.
Larkin did move on rapidly from Belfast to the next battlefield, Dublin, Cork, elsewhere. But Belfast in 1907 was crucial to his formation and in many senses to the whole formation of the Irish labour movement. Belfast's tragedy is that it was left behind. the fleeting possibilities of those dramatic events of the summer of 1907 were all too soon buried under the twin shrouds of unionism and nationalism.
The independent movement suffered greatly as well, as the dock strike failed, as the unionist movement started to recircle its wagons again to oppose Home Rule. There wasn't room for a dissenting voice at that particular time. On the other side of that, Carson was able to mobilise and re-energise many of those men in opposition to Home Rule, and because of the dock strike and because they were used to organising, they were very much more easy to mobilise at the later period because of what had happened earlier. It's perhaps not the way some would have liked to see them mobilised, but nevertheless it tapped in to that unionist tradition of street politics.
And most people have always said, from 1907 right down to the 1980s, particularly unionists, that if they were in Britain, they would vote Labour. But here they feel constrained because of their allegiance, because of their fear of Dublin rule and the minority, they feel constrained to vote Unionist. On the nationalist side, most working class people will say they would vote Labour in Britain, but here they will vote for Sinn Féin or the SDLP. And that is the situation. It hasn't been resolved since Larkin retraced his steps from Belfast in 1907.
And what of those that Larkin left behind him? Thomas Sloane's political career ended when he lost his seat in 1910. In the pogroms of 1912, his house was burned by an orange mob as he lay ill inside. Joseph Devlin, whose political opportunism had played such a key part, survived as the voice of a nationalist minority beleaguered in a unionist state until his death in 1934. Following his dismissal from the RIC, William Barrett found work as a warden in Dunville Park. He died in Belfast in 1940. His portrait hangs in Moscow, in the People's Hall of Martyrs. Conway Street, where the mill girl Maggie Lennon lived and died, used to run clear from the Falls to the Shankill. Maggie's grave, like the story of the strike itself, has been forgotten. The strike was a failure, but the seismic events of that summer 100 years ago revealed the possibility of a very different future, one we have yet to achieve.
That generation, 100 years ago, fought for elemental justice and equity. We cannot afford to forget them today.
It brought home in a crude way, but a very practical and real way, that they were human beings, and that nothing up to that time had recognized that fact. And it depended on the man himself, how he shaped his future.